The OCD and Anxiety Podcast by Robert James Coaching. Hello and welcome to the OCD and Anxiety Podcast, where we explore how to have a more positive relationship with anxiety disorders, taking back control so that you can start living the life you choose and not the one chosen by your fears. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the podcast. Today I'm interviewing a fascinating lady who is a specialist working with people with OCD, and I'm sure you're going to find this really helpful. Her name is Lauren McMeikan, and she is a licensed marriage and family therapist and is a psychotherapist practicing at the Newport Beach office of the OCD Center of Los Angeles. She received her BA in psychology from UCLA and her MA in clinical psychology from the Antioch University. She practices mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy with a focus on exposure and response prevention and acceptance and commitment therapy. OCD has been the focus of her studies, writing, and work since she began graduate school in 2014. Helping those struggling with OCD is her passion, and she has primarily treated individuals with OCD since 2016. She also focuses on treating people struggling with anxiety disorders and obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders, including body dysmorphic disorder and body-focused repetitive behaviors. She is a certified intuitive eating counselor and treats people with eating disorders and body image struggles. During the interview, we cover many different areas, including mindfulness, acceptance commitment therapy, ERP, choice, learning to accept doubts and discomfort, and much more as well. Do please give us a 5-star rating, as it really helps us to get our message out there, and I really hope you enjoy it. Many thanks. Okay guys, today we're joined by Lauren McMeikan, and she is an OCD specialist who's going to be talking today about her treatment practice with OCD. Welcome to the podcast, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so why did you decide to become a therapist?
So I've always been interested in psychology. In fact, I got my undergraduate degree in psychology from UCLA. And I've been, on and off in therapy since I was a kid. And it was always something that was really valuable to me. And I always found the human mind to be a really fascinating organ too. It's just so complex, right? Yeah. And there's never any shortage of fascinating inquiry into it. And so that certainly drove it. But I also think my own experience, like I said, with therapy was really a huge part of what led me into the field. But I never really knew what realm of therapy I wanted to be in until I underwent treatment for my own OCD diagnosis.
Right.
And I think for me, I sort of reflecting back on my life, I saw that it had been with me for such a very long time, but it had gone undiagnosed. And it had been so immensely helpful for me in living the life that I wanted to live that I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. And I want to help people who, the other 2 to 3% of the population who suffer like I do.
Amazing. Yeah, of course. So because you went through it yourself, you really kind of got to understand OCD in a different kind of way, maybe to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my own therapist was really transparent about his own diagnosis, not that he ever spoke of the content or that was ever a focal point of therapy. But I think the fact that I knew that he understood it from the inside out was really important to me. And it gave me a level of confidence in him and understanding that helped me in my recovery tremendously and continues to.
Oh, fantastic. And it kind of answers my next question as well, which was, obviously about why you chose to specialize in anxiety and OCD.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think this, I don't know. I just think the treatment itself is so brilliant, and how it's tailored to people who struggle with OCD and anxiety, and especially the mindfulness component, which is such a huge part of these third wave behavioral therapies.
Yeah.
It's so, the paradigm shift involved in doing this kind of work is really incredible and remarkable. And you think back to before things like exposure response prevention, CBT really existed, and what life must have looked like for people with OCD and with anxiety. And it just, to have something to share with the world that makes life, not perfect, right? Because OCD is managed. It's not taken away.
Yeah.
We don't get rid of thoughts. I tell my clients that all the time, and I'm sure with the people you're working with, it's like, I wish I could take away your thoughts, but that's not what I do. And I don't have the capacity to do that. I can't, change your feelings either. Right. Like what I can do is help you to have a better relationship with both of those things. But
absolutely. Yeah.
Such a huge change from what it was like maybe, 100 years ago. Right. And living with this disorder then. So
absolutely.
Have something.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, for a long time, I think I was looking for the cure, like the non-existent cure for OCD. And I was thinking there must be a way to deal with this. There must be a way to just get rid of it. And I was trying everything, and obviously nothing worked. And the thing that actually worked best for me in the end was acceptance commitment therapy, which is obviously very, very related to mindfulness. And the skills that I learned from that and from mindfulness were incredible. For dealing with OCD. What was the thing that kind of helped you the most in your own battle with OCD?
What a great question. I think it was the mindfulness component. I think obviously, the CBT with an emphasis on the big B, ERP is, sort of the gold standard. But I think what most dramatically shifted my perspective was mindfulness. And it was this radical idea that I didn't have to fight my own experience. That really was a change for me. Obviously, behavioral therapy and not letting the anxiety limit my life was also huge. But ultimately, it was this idea that I could just be an acceptance of life on life's terms. Yeah,
absolutely. So kind of whatever comes up, it's okay. It's so important. I think for me, the biggest thing, and you just touched on it, is acceptance. No, because I think before I kind of came across meditation and mindfulness and ACT, I was constantly battling with the thoughts. I couldn't accept them at all. It was just like, I can't accept these thoughts. I think in a way as well, like for me, like acceptance at that stage was more of an idea, like a misled idea that acceptance meant somehow that I was agreeing with the thoughts. And obviously, it's not that at all.
Right. But that is such an important distinction. And I think that is, when people first hear about this idea of acceptance, they have to often be clear, I'm sure you do too, that I'm not talking about accepting the content of your thoughts as factual. I'm saying, can you accept the existence of your thoughts? Can you accept the existence of your feelings? And it doesn't mean you have to be enamored of them, right? Like you're not always going to love them, but if you can learn to meet them with an attitude of friendliness, right? That is our power in this, is what attitude we bring to the table. There's a great Viktor Frankl quote that I don't have it memorized, but it's something to the effect of the last thing that you have in your power and your control is the attitude that you bring to the table. And I think that's it. Yeah,
I know that quote. Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember it exactly now either, but
I have it actually instead of butchering it, so that it's in this book right here, because it's one that I turn to quite frequently. Actually, it says, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing: the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." And
Yeah.
We don't have control over our thoughts or our feelings, but we certainly have the ability to meet those things with kindness and compassion and a sense of gentleness and acceptance.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's such a good book. Man's Search for Meaning, no, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
It's absolutely just breathtaking. Yeah.
It really is. And I mean, I think that one of the things is that, I think they use it in Happiness Trap as well to discuss that, how really it's like values, you can live your values in any set of circumstances. And, it's really hard to argue that point when the man who's saying that is somebody who was at the time in a concentration camp, right? Like he's in Auschwitz. So
yeah. It's incredible that number one, that he came through it with having this philosophy. That was the thing that kind of kept him going, was focusing on whether his wife might be alive when he came out. And that was the kind of thing that kind of kept him going. So incredibly sad, but so moving and so powerful and so right. No?
Absolutely. And the attitude, like the values that he brings to like his life in the camp as well, with being of service to the people around him and trying to find connection. It's so right on. And I can speak for my values anyway, which I think it, has values work has a lot of implication in OCD work as well. But I think that I know that the sense of connection and community is hugely important.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a really, really big one as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think with like the values element too, it's so important, it can be so important within the realm of ERP, because in the absence of compulsions, that if you want to, I think especially with mental compulsions, having something to refocus your attention on is paramount, right? And that can be the present moment. And it's also helpful to have, some richness in your life that you're turning to put your attention on. It's, and it's in keeping with the life that you want to build.
Absolutely. Yeah. For me, ACT is interesting because in a way it's a little bit like ERP. Because you are kind of like choosing to when you're really feeling the anxiety and you're really very, very tempted to start performing compulsions, you're kind of telling yourself in that moment, you know what, I have a choice here. I could perform this compulsion, or in this moment I could put my attention onto something that I value instead. And
Absolutely.
You're going to feel a lot of anxiety about that, but you're gonna choose to do it anyway. And that's a little bit like ERP. It's not ERP, but there are similarities like between the two. No,
I think so. Absolutely. I think, and I think even, traditional mindfulness meditation can be ERP in some respects, right? Like if you have, that maybe it's more passive exposure, right? Like you have a thought that just pops up, right, while you're meditating, and then you get hooked, right?
Yeah.
And the ritual prevention is to drop the rumination, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think ERP exists in a lot of different forms, right? And I think, we tend to focus on the active exposure and ritual prevention, but I tell my clients regularly that so much of it is about sort of the passive exposures that come up in daily life, and that the hierarchy that we often work from is just a way of practicing that, so that you can build those skills, so that when you're out in the real world, that you have the capacity to make a different choice.
Yeah, absolutely. It all comes down to choice. And so often we forget that with OCD. We forget that, we do ultimately have a choice in the situation, like we were just talking about with Viktor Frankl. It's like it can feel like you don't have a choice. It can, OCD does that. It kind of feels like it takes your power away. And it's a really important thing to remember, I think, that, you do have that power, and you can choose to put your attention onto something more positive. I think, again, with ACT, the good thing about that and having the values is when you have something that you really value and is really important to you, it makes it just a little bit easier to be able to put your attention onto that thing. Like if it's not something that you value, then it's like, well,
why am I going to bother putting my attention onto this thing instead? But if you've worked it out beforehand, you care about this thing, then it gives you a little bit more motivation and a bit more reason to do it.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. I think, and that's, I think that's played a part in my, in my life as well, just in terms of like, that's a big part of why I chose this career too. I imagine it's a big part of why you chose your career, is this values element, and that, having that richness to turn to is hugely important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just on the theme of ERP still, what are some of the benefits of using mindfulness in conjunction with ERP?
Well, I think the benefits are huge. I think, like I said, especially with mental rituals, because I think that the ability to refocus your attention, with the acceptance component, of course, in there as well, to accept the thoughts, to allow them to still be present, but to bring your attention toward something that you care about it's the whole thing, right? And I was explaining this to a client recently who has a lot of mental rituals, and the general theme, which I see a lot, is that people really want to get into the exposure part of work, right? And they're like, when's the exposure going to start?
Yeah.
And I was trying to point out, as we were talking about mindfulness, that the real key here is in the ritual prevention, right? Exposures are happening all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
No shortage of them in your life.
Yeah.
But we need to be able to stop you from doing the rituals. And so I think that it helps with refocusing with the mental rituals. I also think that it really helps with awareness of the urge, right? So like the urge to do a ritual, which can be kind of tricky sometimes. That you, especially if it's really habitual at a certain point, that you just sort of launch into doing the compulsion almost thoughtlessly. So to sort of heighten awareness of that in a really kind way, right? That doesn't turn into self-flagellation, which so many people do, tend to engage in.
Yeah.
And then I think also the feelings component, right? Because the reason that we do compulsions is because we don't want to feel discomfort. We don't want to feel anxiety. We don't want to feel any sense of uncertainty. So we're doing this thing to get rid of those feelings. Also, one that comes up a lot in the room for me is like the sense of I'm being irresponsible if I don't do the compulsion, right? And so you have to be willing to make space for so many emotions that we don't really, I don't think as a society, have much education surrounding how to make room for feelings, how to be with feelings without letting them control you, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, my background is actually in teaching. I worked as a teacher for 15 years. So, it's a relatively recent thing moving into the coaching world. But yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, we should be teaching children how to deal with more, emotional problems, because right now it's like there's an epidemic, of anxiety disorders, with depression, mental health issues in general. And if children were taught a little bit more about how to manage their emotions in a more healthy way, then that would be a big step in the right direction.
Yes, I could not agree more. And I've always thought that at some stage I'd like to try to get involved in the education system in terms of sharing these ideas, and hopefully, like, I think that there's increasingly more curriculum based on mindfulness and teaching that to young ones as in an attempt to support like emotional regulation. I think I don't know if you know Sam Harris. He's sort of like a public intellectual. He's got his own podcast.
Yeah, I know Sam Harris. Yeah. Yeah, I love his podcast.
Yeah, no, it's a great podcast, and the app Waking Up is lovely as well. But his wife, you may know this then if you listen to the podcast regularly, that his wife, Annika Harris.
Yeah, she did. She wrote a book recently about consciousness that was quite interesting.
Yeah. But so much of her work entails like working with young ones and around, meditation, mindfulness, that kind of stuff. I think is so critical.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's just like within the realm of like all the online forums with OCD and the Instagram and everything. There's so much normalizing that happens when you start talking about these things early on, because I think so many of us feel so isolated in this experience of having this mind that's constantly chattering. But the reality is, to some greater or lesser extent, we all have it, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that. At some point, somebody's going to experience, they're going to get stuck on something and they're going to get completely obsessed about it. And they're going to go around in circles thinking about it. And that it will be, that is obsessive and compulsive. No, it's... Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Can you recommend any meditations that are particularly helpful for people from your experience working with mindfulness and meditation?
Yeah. So what I can say is generally I introduce people to focused attention meditation as a starting point with some sort of an object. Oftentimes I'll use the breath. Of course, sometimes you run into, people who find the breath and using that as an anchor to actually be an exposure unto itself, especially people with panic. So
absolutely.
And some sensory motor obsessions also fall into that category. So using different things like sound or their physical touch, right, to come back to. So essentially using that as an anchor in the present moment, noticing when your thoughts wander. I'm sure you know all about this, but just for listeners who aren't, who haven't practiced meditation, that, the whole practice being that, like, can we catch when we get lost in thought and practice refocusing our attention on the object of our meditation without being unkind, right? Like with an attitude of curiosity, like, oh, there's a thought. I love the way that Pema Chodron talks about it, like with the gentleness of a feather touching a bubble, right? Like you're trying not to pop.
Right? That's a great way to great analogy. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. But I think I usually start there with people so that they have like the understanding of what it is to be present. Although, to be honest, meditation is great. It's a huge part of my life these days. When I first got into treatment, it wasn't. And I think one of the things that I think it's important to note is that mindfulness is, or meditation is a means for mindfulness. It's not mindfulness itself. It's a good way to practice, for sure. And to do so in sort of a vacuum where it's easier to notice when your attention is gone and redirect the attention. But that it is possible, right, to practice mindfulness without meditation. In terms of other meditations that I'll drop in, I was introduced through Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche to, not personally, but through listening, to open awareness meditation, which was not as aware of, which has been a really interesting element too, and I think can be really helpful in terms of OCD treatment, just because that's essentially what we're looking for anyway, is just to be mindful of all of our experience. So instead of having one object of meditation that you're constantly returning to, that you're just you're aware without judgment of everything that comes into your perception. Yeah.
So obviously, obviously, like formal meditation is fantastic, and doing that 20 minutes a day or 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening or however long you want is great. But that's formal meditation, and as like John Kabat-Zinn would say, like everywhere you go, there you are, which we would take as whatever you're doing throughout your day, like try to remain like mindful about it and be aware of what's going on, and kind of
beautiful.
Very.
Yeah, absolutely. I got back from a silent retreat over the new year, and that's the idea, is that you're basically I was there for 5 days, right? Like you are in constant meditation. You're doing walking meditation. You're doing sitting meditation.
Wow.
You're doing
Yeah.
eating meditation. You're doing, laying on the couch meditation, right? Which is intense. But I actually at one point I was taking the whole thing a bit too seriously. I wasn't really bringing that attitude of curiosity and gentleness to the work as much. So I decided that I would mindfully build a snow slide, which I did. So as I was out in the snow and I didn't have a sled, but I was sort of, committed to, I'm going to mindfully build the slide and I'm going to mindfully slide down it. So to your point, it really can, you can meditate doing pretty much anything. That's the core of mindfulness. I will say that I like meditation apps, especially for people who are new to it. I think it can be really nice and containing. And I personally like the 10% Happier app, with Joseph Goldstein, a lot of Sharon Salzberg on there. So they're really solid teachers. And I also like Headspace. I think it's, a really great introduction into the world of mindfulness. So
Okay. Yeah. And sorry, just one more question whilst we're on the topic of meditation. Is like self-compassion you mentioned earlier. And it's certainly something that when I was struggling with OCD, I used to beat myself up a lot all the time about why I was having these thoughts and why couldn't I control them. And, kind of just it was very difficult, and I was very hard on myself. And something that really helped with that for me was like loving kindness meditations. Mm-hmm. Do you sometimes recommend those as well, or is that something?
Absolutely. I think that metta or maitri, depending on the tradition that you're talking about, it's fantastic, and especially doing like loving kindness meditation towards oneself, I think can be lovely. And I also think that just the general idea of being kind to yourself around this is so important, right? Somebody explains to me, or it said to me in a certain way that I liked, that if we had like a mixing board, right, with all the dials and knobs and whatever the pulley system is, I'm not aware of the technical terms here, but related to our brain, we just set it to happy all the time, and we just set it to nice thoughts, right? And so I think the recognition that we're not choosing this. I think there's so much rhetoric around there of like, I'm self-sabotaging, or I'm doing this to myself, and I'm making a conscious decision to have these thoughts, or especially within the realm of OCD, people are like, what if I'm having these thoughts on purpose, right? But the reality is that if you really think about it, most of us are quite clear that, given the chance, we just have nice, happy thoughts all the time and nice, happy feelings all the time, but that's just not how it works. And so I think that gives tremendous space for self-compassion when these thoughts and feelings do come up.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Great. What are some of the most common OCD themes that you deal with?
So they're all over the map. I think Jonathan Grayson says it, that OCD is like the variants of OCD are as creative as the individuals that have them.
Absolutely, yeah. That's so true.
And, I think it's lovely that we have these categories, because I think they're very normalizing to people, to know that there are other people who have this particular worry. And it's a nice thing to be able to read about people with these, with similar obsessions, so that you can kind of learn how to respond to those obsessions in a more helpful manner. But I think, the answer in that respect is that lots and lots of different kinds. I think right now in my practice, I'm seeing, for some reason, just a lot of POCD, but which is, for those listening, pedophile-themed OCD. But that hasn't always been the case. And I, worked with a lot of people with relationship obsessions. I've worked with a lot of people with harm OCD, with moral scrupulosity, which the thing is, too, that they all sort of combine, right? Like POCD has elements of moral scrupulosity, has elements of harm, right? And they all sort of intertwine at some level. So, but certainly people with sort of more traditional fears of contamination, health anxiety. I have a particular affinity for working with people with body dysmorphia, which, although not an OCD subtype per se, is of course on the compulsive spectrum and shares many similarities. And yeah, so I work with people also with disordered eating, and that's sort of a niche passion of mine as well. So there, the body image epidemic in this, world related to perfectionism and, wanting to look a certain way is so toxic. And but all over the map. And I think, the content just, is irrelevant, right?
No, that's exactly what I think. I really couldn't agree more with that, because I don't know what you think, but I imagine that a lot of your clients, they kind of, maybe they start off with one theme and then it changes and morphs over time into different ones. And certainly for me, that was the case. It was as soon as I would feel like, I would be ruminating in my head, and I might get to a place where suddenly I'm like, okay, I've worked it out now. I've got to the bottom of this, and now I don't need to worry about this anymore. And then for 2 beautiful minutes, I would be carefree. And then suddenly from there,
shine.
Yeah, exactly. We're like, yes, I've done it. And then from nowhere, suddenly, a brand new OCD that I hadn't ever thought about before would pop into my head. And that would be it. I would be off again, stuck in the cycle. And over time, I guess but in a way that helped over time, because every time that happened, it just kind of showed me how irrelevant the thoughts were, because, if I could be so obsessed about something at 1 minute, and then suddenly it's not important at all, and another thing has come along and kind of taken that over, it really shows how irrelevant it really is.
Absolutely. And I often will point to that with my clients who have had different themes of obsession over time. But I think it is helpful to see where it just sort of content hops from one thing to the next. And it's really more about the process, right? It's really more about you could be anxious about anything. And if you're waiting to not be anxious to enjoy your life, right, then you're only ever going to get those 2 minutes.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there may be a week between, right, where you're just trying to sort out and come to some sort of resolution, and then you find the resolution, maybe, right? Or I think it's where people tend to really hit their knees with this disorder, though, is when you can't find a resolution, right? When and there are things where it's there is no for sure, right? And there is no for sure with anything, but, existential themes and, I think all of the themes you can just get so caught up in.
Yes.
There's always something else to be unknown about, right? There's all,
Yeah. I mean, So in that regard, then a huge part of recovery is kind of being okay with that tiny, tiny, tiny bit of doubt that you might have about something.
That may feel gargantuan, right? Because that's the thing, is that we hyper focus on the doubt, and then it feels really, really big. Even though we can perceive it logically as that's just I know that all of the signs point to this thing not being true, that the feeling is so overwhelming, and being willing to sit with that feeling, being willing to tolerate that bit of uncertainty is, I think, at the core of treatment.
Yeah, it's key. It really is. Yeah. But like you say, incredibly hard to do. When the anxiety is really up and you're really stuck in an obsession and you can't think of anything else, it's so hard. But it's key. It really is.
Yeah, agreed.
Do you have any tips for people who are working with ERP but who find it hard?
Well, first of all, I would say that's the most universal experience. Yeah. I don't know a person who's come into my office who's like, oh my gosh, we get to do ERPs. It's so exciting, right? The people who have read about it before are like, what about this ERP thing? When do we have to do that? And I'm like, don't worry. Like, we'll
build up slowly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That it's very gradual. And that I think to be really gentle with yourself in the process, to appreciate every win, right? I think our tendency is to discount our wins in this process. And, like working with somebody with agoraphobia, right, which isn't OCD per se, but very much linked to, I didn't walk far enough outside of the house today. It's like, but you walked outside of the house today, right? Like that's a win. And just comparing yourself to this other standard that you think you should be to, doesn't mean that you're not being effective and that you're not working toward recovery. So to really appreciate the baby steps that you are taking, even if you perceive them to be like minuscule, I think is a huge part of I think a hugely helpful thing in the process of ERP. Yeah,
I totally agree. So important.
Right? Because otherwise it's like trying to build a house without a foundation, right? Like you have to put in those small building blocks in order to ever get anywhere. And so if you're constantly just like pushing those blocks aside, being like, well, that's nothing, then what are you building on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of move up the scale of ERPs, I guess you have to start small and like you said, build that foundation. You can't just go in at the start and start doing like 9 out of 10 ERPs, because you're going to it's going to make people worse.
Yeah. Well, and it's just going to lead to lots of rituals, right? And like even if it's just mentally, right? And I think, there's, new with the sort of inhibitory learning theory movement that, there's some benefit to doing things in like, not in order, right? Like that you're not necessarily just going like 3, 4, 5, 6 up the hierarchy, right? And that it's okay to do like a 3 and then a 7, right? To do something that sort of surprises you. Like I bet you know more about inhibitory learning than a lot of us in the obsessive compulsive disorder field, like because of your background working with children. But I think to contradict your expectations, right, is an important element in that realm. And so, it's not necessarily always going to be like, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, up your subjective units of distress scale. But yeah, I think, that to be kind to yourself in that process is really helpful. And I think to take it one thing at a time, really.
Yeah. Okay. So again, coming back to that self-compassion thing, and taking things slowly and building things up and acknowledging those wins that you have made is incredibly important. Okay.
Yeah. So,
great.
Yeah.
Coming on to compulsions, because compulsions are obviously the major thing that keeps the cycle of OCD going. What can people learn to do instead of performing compulsions?
So this is where I think values, right? Like going back to our discussion of values is so key. You can do anything other than a compulsion, really.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we want you, when I talk to people about refocusing their attention on something else, sort of like going back to Jeffrey Schwartz's 4-stage model, which, is not necessarily exactly what I do, but that I derive from, right? Like the relabeling and the refocusing, right? It's important when you refocus that you're not refocusing on something that's hollow, right? Like if I'm refocusing on, okay, I'm going to count to 50, right? That's just going to become another compulsion. It's like, I'm just trying to keep the thoughts out, as opposed to being willing to have the thoughts, right? And to do something else at the same time, right? To bring your attention towards something else without doing the behaviors, like the follow-up behavior, whether that's reassurance seeking or avoidance or, something behavioral like checking or rumination, right? That you want to have something that's meaningful to you to bring your attention to. And sometimes that's just the present moment, right? Sometimes that's just the feeling of your toes in your shoes and, your hair against your neck and whatever that is. Right.
Yeah.
So I think the present is an important, thing, like element that you can bring your attention to when you have the desire to do a compulsion, and that bringing your attention to the present can take many forms. Sometimes that's just, sensory experience. Sometimes that's, playing an instrument, or really focusing on the conversation that you're having and what the person's saying, and trying to be caring and compassionate, or, sometimes it looks like bringing your attention back to what the characters are saying in the movie that you're watching. And sometimes it's the feeling of your feet as you're running across the pavement, whatever it is that, you just trying. I think the answer is do anything as long as it's in keeping with your values and you're doing it mindfully.
Yeah. And I guess if it's something that brings you into your body kind of and out of your head, then that's
Absolutely.
kind of, absolutely. Yeah.
Especially for people who are mental ritualizers, for sure. Right. Because that's, important.
In ACT, that we talk quite a lot about anchoring activities, which is basically some of the things you were mentioning there. So one anchoring activity that they mention in ACT is kind of coming into your body. So kind of, maybe pushing down into your feet, stretching up with your arms, and kind of noticing things around you. What can you smell? What can you touch? What can you hear? And sorry, that's just my girlfriend coming in, and my dog Bruno jumping on me.
Hi, Bruno. Hi, girlfriend.
Sorry. Okay. So next question. We're almost done. The anxiety that people get from their obsessions is sometimes so strong. We always hear that we should accept the anxiety, but sometimes that can be hard to do. In your experience, what is meant by acceptance, and how does it help?
So, like we were talking about earlier, I think so much of acceptance is just about an allowance and like a willingness to experience whatever's happening. I think a huge component of acceptance that a lot of people miss is that you're not accepting it forever. You're accepting it for now, right? Yeah. And the one thing that we do know for certain is that everything changes, right? That's like the only constant, is that you're not going to have a feeling forever. You're not going to think about only one thing forever. It's, you might think about it a lot. You might have a feeling a lot, but there's always going to be moments where you're not fixated on that thing. And so to be willing to have that experience in the moment, I think is what my understanding of acceptance is. And I think the willingness to, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. I knew it happens to me at least once a day now, aging. But wow. The general idea of accepting each moment as it comes. Oh, I know what I was going to say, is that the thing is that with resistance, right, which is what we're doing with thoughts and feelings if we're not accepting them often.
Yes. Yeah.
That resistance of things like thoughts and feelings that we can't control is it's futile, right? Like it's not going to get us anywhere. In fact, it's only going to increase suffering. Right? Because the experience of resistance, especially when there's no potential gain from it, is quite unpleasant unto itself, right? And it's going to sort of, I think of it that there's quite a lot of similarity between the feeling of resistance and the feeling of anxiety, right? So basically, you're building the anxiety as you're resisting it,
yes.
And so much of it is about being willing to meet, like the acceptance piece. The question that you had is that being willing to meet the anxiety with something gentler and softer that, is actually in a way it sort of, by meeting like anxiety with friendliness, it dissipates in some ways on impact, right? Like not that we do that with that intention, because if your secret agenda is to change the feeling, that doesn't help. But if you're really willing to just, bring it in and say, okay, this is where we are right now, that it becomes infused with that that gentleness and that softness and that acceptance. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I sort of.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a really, really important message. Great. And the final question.
Oh.
If you could tell people with OCD one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I could tell people with OCD one thing, I think it would be that you can have this experience of anxiety and experience other things simultaneously. That just because it's present doesn't mean it has to be the focal point of your life at all times. And I know that can be really difficult when you've got this voice shouting in your head to pay attention, right? And you've got this really overwhelming feeling that something's going to go horribly awry, whether that's you're going to, molest a child, or you're going to kill somebody, or you're going to get some terrible disease, or right. Like that feeling can be so overwhelming. And so I think to be able to recognize that you can have that and you can simultaneously cultivate other experiences is one of the more important messages, because I think that we're so busy, those of us with OCD, trying to eradicate the discomfort, that we miss the joy that happens when the discomfort is happening.
Yes, that's so true. It's so true. You can kind of forget to get on with living your life because you get so obsessed with the OCD. It becomes a central thing, and anxiety takes over, and you kind of somewhere in your mind you make a decision, and I think I did for a number of years of like everything's on hold until I get to the bottom of this. And actually you don't have to live like that. You can have anxiety and you can get on and live a really amazing life anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not always going to feel amazing, and that's okay, right? Yeah. They're going to be amazing moments. And I think, you were talking of the 2 minutes of solace that follow, like sort of the figuring it out, right, with one obsession. Yeah. And I think when I look at it from that vantage point, there's much more opportunity for joy when we're willing to accept that anxiety and thoughts are going to be a part of the picture. And then it is if I'm completely rejecting the notion that I'm going to be anxious, because then I'm so focused on getting rid of the anxiety that not only does the anxiety become the focal point of my life, but I guess that's to the point, right? Like then I'm blinded by the anxiety because it's taking up all of my periphery, versus if I and it's very much in keeping with ACT, right? Like the idea of the piece of paper exercise. I'm blanking on the name itself. Where it's sitting in your lap versus when you've got it and you're holding it out like that. And it's like, it's much more in your view. It's, it's causing tension versus allowing it to be a part of the scene. Right. Yeah.
No, I think he actually calls it the piece of paper exercise or something very similar. So nothing too genius with the name.
Yeah. I like it. That's good for me and my simple brain. So,
Okay, fantastic. Lauren, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. And
likewise, thanks so much for having me on. It's always a treat to get to talk about this and to spread awareness. And I just love talking with you. It's wonderful.
Oh, that's great. Many thanks, Lauren. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Lauren today. Do please check out the next one. And if you would like to give us a 5-star rating, that would be amazing. Remember, if you want to know more about me, you can check me out on Instagram, Robert James Coaching UK. You can go and join the Facebook group if you like, the Robert James Coaching Anxiety and OCD Support Group. And also you can check out my website, www.robertjamescoaching.com. Many thanks. And now just a quick reminder of my disclaimer. Any information that you view on my website, Instagram page, Facebook group, or anywhere else online, or any information that you listen to on the podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for actual medical or mental health advice from a doctor, psychologist, or any other medical or mental health professional.